They read my father's will under those buzzing fluorescent lights, and the words cut deeper than any knife. My daughter must take a DNA test. I didn't flinch. Not in front of them. Don't skip this. This revenge story will leave you breathless. From the very first moment to the final reveal, you won't be able to look away. I folded my hands neatly in my lap just like my mother taught me when I was a girl, and I sat still. But inside I felt the room tilt. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and floor polish. The tick of the clock on the wall seemed louder than breathing. I saw my sister's lips curve into that sharp little smile. The kind of smile she used to wear when she beat me at school contests, or when she slipped into Dad's lap while I was told to sit down. Her perfectly painted nails tapped against the oak table, a steady rhythm of victory. She thought this was the end of me. But what none of them knew, what none of them could know, was that I wasn't walking into this blind. I carried a secret of my own. The lawyer cleared his throat, his voice trembling slightly as though he'd rather be anywhere else. His thin wire glasses slipped down his nose. He repeated the line again, slower, as if my hearing was poor. A DNA test will be required. The words hung in the stale air. My mother shifted in her chair. I caught the flick of her eyes down toward her lap, the way her fingers twisted the edge of her scarf. She looked like a woman gripping the edges of a cliff. It was only a second, but I saw it. That small flash of fear she thought she had buried for decades. And I tucked it away quietly without letting anyone know I noticed. I suppose we should get it done quickly, my sister said, her voice syrupy sweet, but her eyes fixed on me like knives. I smiled back at her. A small, steady smile. The kind that says, you think you've won but you haven't even seen the board yet. The lawyer shuffled his papers nervously as though eager to move on. But I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms, letting the silence stretch. Sometimes silence is louder than shouting. I thought about my father then. About the way he used to praise my sister for every little thing she did. How he called her his golden girl. How he looked at me sometimes like I was a burden. Even at the end he made sure his last words were heavy with doubt. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that doubt can be turned into power. The room grew hotter. The heater hummed low in the corner, rattling slightly with every gust. I could hear the faint tapping of rain against the window, soft and steady, like someone drumming their fingers on glass. Is this really necessary? I asked finally, my voice calm even. My father's gone. Does humiliating me bring him peace? The lawyer looked startled, caught between duty and decency. It's in the will, he said softly as though apologizing. My sister leaned forward, her perfume sickly sweet filling my nose. Rules are rules, she said, almost gleeful. I studied her face carefully. The flawless makeup, the gold earrings catching the light, the smug tilt of her chin. She believed she was untouchable. She believed Dad's words made her untouchable. I let her think that. Because while she stared at me with triumph in her eyes, I was staring at Mother. Watching her chest rise and fall too fast. Watching the way her hand clenched around the hem of her sleeve. Something in her body betrayed her. A tremor she couldn't control. And I knew. Oh, I knew then, this was bigger than me. The lawyer excused himself briefly to fetch another folder. My sister pulled out her phone, already texting someone, maybe bragging. The glow of the screen lit her face, smug and satisfied. That left just me and my mother in that stiff little room. I leaned slightly toward her, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to hear me when I whispered, "You're shaking." Her eyes snapped to mine, wide, startled, and for a moment I thought she might deny it. But she didn't. She just pressed her lips together, tight, thin, pale. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice cracked on the last word. I leaned back again, folding my arms, my own heartbeat steady. I had no intention of pushing her. Not yet. Not there. The lawyer returned and the meeting resumed, but I no longer heard his words. My mind was busy. Busy piecing together what my mother's fear meant. Dad thought this DNA test was a weapon to cut me down. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't pointed at me at all. When it was over, we filed out into the hallway. The carpet was worn, the fluorescent lights flickering above us. My sister walked ahead, her heels clicking confidently against the floor. My mother trailed behind, her purse clutched tight, her head bowed slightly. I slowed my steps, letting my sister move further ahead, until it was just me and Mother walking side by side. "You knew about this," I murmured. Her eyes darted to mine, alarmed. Don't start, she whispered harshly. I smiled again, calm, steady. I don't need to start anything, I said. It's already begun. She froze for half a second, then looked away. That was all the confirmation I needed. Outside, the rain had grown heavier. It splashed against the pavement, bouncing up in tiny droplets. The air smelled of wet asphalt. My sister hurried to her car, flipping her umbrella open with a practiced flick. She didn't look back. I stood under the overhang for a moment, letting the damp air settle on my skin. My mother hovered beside me, silent, her breathing uneven. Finally, she said quietly, "Don't you dare twist this." I turned to her, studying the lines on her face, the way years of secrets had carved shadows under her eyes. "I don't have to twist anything," I replied softly. "The truth twists itself." Her face went pale. We rode home in silence. The windshield wipers squeaked back and forth. My sister kept humming in the passenger seat like a child with a secret toy. My mother sat stiffly, her gaze fixed straight ahead. I sat in the back, hands folded neatly, staring at the raindrops racing each other down the glass. My pulse was steady. My mind sharper than it had ever been. Let them think I was humiliated. Let them believe I had lost. Because I knew something they didn't. This DNA test was never going to be my downfall. It was going to be hers. And when we pulled into the driveway and my sister jumped out laughing, and my mother lingered in the front seat for just a second too long, I leaned forward, close to her ear. "Secrets don't stay buried forever," I whispered. She flinched. I smiled. And the story had only just begun. Secrets don't stay buried forever. Those were the last words I whispered into my mother's ear before she flinched and looked away. I carried them with me in the days that followed like a stone in my pocket, heavy, cold, unshakable. The DNA envelope arrived 2 weeks later. Ordinary, thin, tucked into a stack of bills and advertisements on my kitchen counter. For a moment, it almost blended in with the noise of life. The overdue water bill, the grocery store coupon sheet. But I knew what it was before I even touched it. The paper was lighter than I expected, fragile almost, but my hands shook when I picked it up. The seal was unbroken, crisp. My heart thudded once, then again louder, like it was knocking from inside my ribs. I didn't open it right away. I left it on the counter for hours, watching it as I washed dishes, folded laundry, even fed the cat. It sat there like a quiet bomb, waiting for the moment it would explode. And when I finally did tear it open, the sound of ripping paper was sharp enough to make me flinch. My sister insisted on being there. She sat across the table, her back straight, her lipstick freshly applied as if she were attending some victory ceremony. "Go on," she urged, her eyes gleaming. "Let's get this over with." My mother lingered in the corner, arms folded tight across her chest. Her eyes refused to meet mine. I pulled the paper from the envelope, smoothing the creases with steady hands. My breath slowed, not out of calm but out of control. If I let myself breathe too fast, I might give something away. The words were clinical, sterile. No emotion. Just numbers, percentages, results. But the meaning hit like thunder. She wasn't my father's daughter. The silence after was thicker than any scream. My sister blinked once, twice, as though the words couldn't possibly belong to her. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. For the first time in years, she looked small. I folded the paper slowly, deliberately, and set it down on the table. Her voice finally cracked the silence, sharp and panicked. "This is wrong. It has to be wrong." But I just looked at her. Calm, steady. A mirror of the moment at the lawyer's office, except now the power had shifted. My mother gasped, a sound too dramatic to be honest, like a bad actress in a play. She clutched at her chest, her eyes darting between us. "This doesn't change anything," she said quickly, too quickly. "We're still a family." But I cut her off with a single look. She shut her mouth, her words hanging unfinished in the air. My sister pushed her chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the wooden floor. She stood, pacing, her heels clicking like a frantic metronome. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "Everyone knows I was Dad's favorite. He wouldn't love me if I wasn't his." I didn't answer. I just let the silence answer for me. Later that night, I found her sitting outside on the porch, the cold air making her shiver. She held a glass of wine, her hand trembling so badly that the liquid sloshed over the rim. She didn't look at me when I stepped outside. "What are you staring at?" she snapped, her voice raw. "I'm staring at someone who always thought she was untouchable," I said quietly. She laughed, a bitter sound. And you're enjoying this, aren't you? I didn't deny it. The days that followed were strange. Word hadn't spread yet, but tension hung in the house like smoke. My sister avoided my gaze, her confidence fractured. My mother busied herself with pointless chores, scrubbing the sink, rearranging pantry shelves, anything to avoid conversation. Me. I waited. Patiently. Because the cracks were already showing and I knew they would only grow. A few mornings later I overheard my sister on the phone. She was in the kitchen, her voice sharp with desperation. "I don't care what the paper says," she hissed. "I am his daughter. I am." I couldn't hear the reply, but her voice broke after that. "No. Don't say that. Don't you dare say that." When she noticed me in the doorway, she froze. Her face went pale. Then without a word she hung up the phone and brushed past me, the smell of her perfume clinging like smoke. She didn't come out of her room the rest of the day. One evening I sat with my mother at the dinner table. The silence between us stretched long, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally I asked, "How long were you going to keep it hidden?" Her fork clattered against her plate. She stared at me, her face tight. "Don't you dare," she whispered. "Don't you dare act like you understand." I leaned closer, my voice low. "I don't need to understand. I just need to know how long you thought the truth could stay buried." She said nothing. She just stared at her plate, her knuckles white as she gripped her fork. It was around this time that neighbors began to notice. They'd always seen my sister as the golden child, the perfect daughter, the one who carried our family name with pride. But now she carried herself differently. Her posture slouched, her laugh forced, her smile cracked at the edges. At church I caught whispers. Nothing clear, not yet, but enough. A sideways glance, a hushed tone. And every time I watched my mother's shoulders stiffen. The envelope had done more than expose a fact. It had shifted the ground beneath us. My sister wasn't just shaken, she was unraveling. The woman who once looked at me with pity and superiority now looked at me like I was the only steady ground she had left. But I didn't reach out. I let her drown in her own reflection. One night she burst into my room. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks, her eyes red. "Tell me this isn't true," she begged, holding the paper in her hands, wrinkled from being clutched too tightly. I sat up slowly, studying her. "You already know it's true," I said. She sank onto the edge of the bed, sobbing. "Then who am I?" she whispered. Her voice was so small it startled me. This was the sister who always towered over me, who always knew her place. And now she didn't know anything at all. I didn't answer her question. I couldn't. Because the answer wasn't mine to give. The next morning my mother refused to come downstairs. She stayed in her room, the door locked, the curtains drawn. My sister didn't eat. She didn't speak. And I felt the shift inside me. For the first time I wasn't the shadow. I wasn't the forgotten daughter, the one cast aside. The power was mine. But power I knew was dangerous. Because as I looked at my sister crumbling and my mother retreating into silence, I realized this was only the beginning. The truth had cracked the surface, but what lay beneath, that was still waiting. And I wasn't about to let it stay hidden. That night the house was silent. My sister locked herself in her room, her muffled crying drifting faintly through the walls. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, the steam long gone, the bitter scent rising like a warning. The old clock above the stove ticked, each second slower than the last. And then I heard it. Soft footsteps, hesitant, coming down the hall. My mother. She stopped in the doorway, her hand resting on the frame. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, shoulders hunched, hair flattened from the pillow. She didn't speak. Just stared at me, her eyes dark, uncertain. "Sit," I said quietly. She did. We sat across from each other, the light from the single lamp between us casting shadows on her face. For years she had been composed, untouchable, her every movement deliberate. But tonight her hands fidgeted. Her thumb rubbed circles into the edge of her sleeve. "You've been waiting for this," she whispered finally. I didn't deny it. "Yes." Her lips trembled, but she nodded as though she had known this moment would come all along. I leaned forward, my voice steady. "Who is he?" Her head dropped, and for a long moment I thought she wouldn't answer. Then in a voice barely louder than breath she said, "A doctor. Years ago." The words sat heavy between us. "What kind of doctor?" I pressed. Her eyes flickered up to mine, then away. A surgeon. French. He worked at the hospital for a short time. Your father never knew. The name wasn't spoken, but I didn't need it yet. My heart pounded, not with shock but with the weight of confirmation. I had seen her fear at the will reading. I had felt the tremor in her voice when the envelope was opened. And now she was giving me the thread. A thin, fragile thread, but enough to start unraveling the tapestry she'd spent decades weaving. 34 years, I said slowly, letting the number roll off my tongue. You carried this for 34 years. Her hands covered her face. It was a mistake, she whispered. I shook my head. A mistake doesn't last 3 decades. She dropped her hands, tears shining in her eyes. I loved him, she said, her voice cracking. Not the way I loved your father. But I loved him once. The kettle clicked softly on the counter as it cooled. I stared at her, the woman who raised me, the woman I thought I knew. Does my sister know? I asked. Her face paled. No, he can't. She mustn't. I leaned back, folding my arms. She already knows. She just doesn't want to believe it. Her breath caught in her throat, sharp and ragged. For a long stretch of silence, the only sound was the clock ticking. Then my mother reached for my hand across the table. Her skin was cold, trembling. I need you to protect her, she begged. Don't let this ruin her. I pulled my hand back, slowly, deliberately. She spent her whole life mocking me, I said. You let her believe she was better. You let him believe she was his pride and joy. Her eyes filled with tears. I was protecting her. No, I said quietly. You were protecting yourself. The next morning, sunlight crept weakly through the blinds, striping the kitchen floor. My sister came downstairs, her eyes swollen from crying, her steps unsteady. She didn't speak to me, didn't look at me, just poured herself a cup of coffee and sat silently at the table. My mother busied herself at the sink, scrubbing plates that were already clean. Her silence was louder than words. I sipped my own tea, watching both of them. The fracture between us wasn't just visible anymore. It was widening. Later that day the phone rang. My mother answered quickly, almost too quickly. Yes, she said, her voice low. Yes, I understand. Her back was to me, but I watched her shoulders stiffen. She hung up without saying goodbye. Who was that? I asked. She turned, forcing a thin smile. No one. But her eyes betrayed her. And I knew she was lying again. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall. My mind replayed her words. A French surgeon. Over and over like a drumbeat. I pictured her younger, slipping out of the house, meeting him under sterile hospital lights. I imagined my father at home, waiting, blind to what was happening behind his back. And I realized something that made my stomach twist. She hadn't confessed everything yet. The following evening I cornered her in the kitchen. The air smelled faintly of garlic and onions from dinner. The dishwasher hummed softly. You're still hiding something, I said. Her head jerked up, her eyes wide. I've told you the truth. Not all of it, I pressed. Who called yesterday? Her lips pressed tight, a flicker of fear in her eyes. It doesn't matter, she whispered. It matters to me. For the first time she snapped. You don't understand what it was like back then. Your father was strict, cold, always gone. I was alone. And when he came into my life She stopped herself, her breath ragged. Her words hung between us, heavy with confession she didn't want to finish. I stepped closer. You thought you could bury it forever. But now it's out. And the more you try to hide, the worse it gets. Her eyes filled with tears again, but she said nothing. My sister walked in then, her hair messy, her eyes hollow. She looked at us both, suspicion etched across her face. What are you two whispering about? She asked bitterly. My mother shook her head quickly. Nothing. Just the past. But my sister's gaze lingered on me. She saw something there, something in my silence, my steady calm. And I saw the question forming in her eyes, the one she was too afraid to ask. That night I sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker outside. The air smelled faintly of rain again. I thought about what she said, about love, about loneliness, about choices made in secret. I thought about the years of favoritism, the years I was left in the shadows while my sister was lifted high. And I thought about how fragile it all had been. One envelope, one sheet of paper had unraveled decades of lies. But I also knew this wasn't the end. My mother had confessed, but not fully. She had given me just enough to keep me quiet, but not enough to satisfy me. And as I watched her move around the house the next day, avoiding my eyes, avoiding my questions, I realized something. She was terrified. And terrified people always slip. The cracks were widening. My sister was breaking. My mother was unraveling. And I was patient. Because the truth, all of it was close. I could feel it in the air. And when it came, it wouldn't just shatter them. It would set me free. The cracks were widening. My sister was breaking. My mother was unraveling. And I was patient. Because silence can be louder than any scream. The morning after that realization, I woke earlier than usual. The house was still, the faint smell of last night's garlic lingering in the air. I moved quietly through the kitchen, brewing my tea, the whistle of the kettle echoing in the emptiness. When my sister stumbled in, her hair unkempt, her robe hanging loosely, she barely glanced at me. She poured coffee with shaky hands, spilling a few drops on the counter. Normally she'd scold me for leaving crumbs, but this time she wiped it herself without a word. I didn't say anything either. Just sipped my tea slowly, letting the silence gnaw at her. Later that day I ran into one of our neighbors at the grocery store. An older woman, Mrs. Green, who always had an opinion about everything. She leaned closer as she asked, "How's your mother holding up?" She seemed tense on Sunday. I smiled politely, placing a carton of eggs in my basket. "Oh, she's managing. It's just been a lot with Dad's will, and other things." I didn't say more. I didn't need to. Her raised eyebrows told me she would fill in the blanks herself. That was the first whisper. Back at home, I caught my mother watching me as I unpacked groceries. Her eyes followed every move, suspicious, restless. "You've been talking," she accused softly. I set down the bread carefully. "I talk all the time, Mother." Her lips tightened, but she said no more. That was the thing about silence. It made people imagine worse than what you'd actually said. My sister started to change in public. She'd once been the one who entered every room with her chin high, her smile dazzling. Now she hesitated. At church, she kept her head bowed. When neighbors asked after her, she offered vague replies, her voice thin. One Sunday I sat beside her in the pew. As the choir sang, I leaned just close enough to whisper, "People notice when you look away." Her fingers tightened around the hymnal until the pages crinkled. She didn't reply. I wasn't cruel with volume. My revenge wasn't a storm. It was a slow leak in the roof, unnoticed until the water stained every ceiling. At the library, I let a comment slip about family secrets being harder to hide these days. At the bakery, I mentioned how hard it was for my mother to keep up appearances. Each word was careful, deliberate, planted like seeds. And people watered them without me asking. My mother tried to fight back in her own way. She started baking pies for neighbors, delivering them with forced smiles. She lingered longer at the post office, chatting loudly as if volume could erase doubt. But the harder she tried, the more obvious it became. People smelled fear. And I didn't have to say much. I just had to let the silence sit between her words and their questions. One night, I found my sister in the living room, staring at old family photos scattered across the coffee table. Her mascara was smudged, her glass of wine nearly empty. She picked up a photo of us as children. Me standing stiff in a plain dress, her beaming in frills beside Dad. "You hated me," she said suddenly. I took the photo gently from her hand. "I didn't hate you. I hated what they made me feel." She laughed bitterly. "You're enjoying this now." I looked at her carefully. "I'm surviving it." Her eyes glistened. She turned away, and for the first time she didn't argue. The whispers grew. At the pharmacy, two women hushed their conversation as I walked past, but I caught the words, "Not his daughter." At church, I noticed how quickly people stopped speaking when my mother entered the room. At home, my sister grew more withdrawn. She stopped answering calls, stopped meeting friends. And still I said almost nothing. My silence was enough. But silence is not just absence. It is pressure. One evening, as we sat at dinner, my mother slammed her fork down. "Stop looking at me like that," she snapped. I hadn't looked at her at all. I'd been staring at my plate, cutting my chicken into small pieces. "Like what?" I asked calmly. "Like you know something," she hissed. I set my fork down slowly. "I don't need to know. Everyone else already wonders." Her face paled. She pushed her chair back and left the table without another word. The house became a place of ghosts. My sister drifted from room to room, carrying her phone but never calling anyone. My mother retreated into her bedroom for hours, sometimes days. I stayed steady, present, the quiet anchor in the storm I had set in motion. And each day I felt the balance shift further. There were small moments that fueled me. At the grocery store, Mrs. Green asked me, "Did you hear about your sister? Poor thing, she looks so tired." At the salon, another woman murmured, "Your mother must be under such strain. I can't imagine what she's hiding." I didn't confirm. I didn't deny. I just smiled faintly, the kind of smile that left space for imagination. And that was worse than any confession. One afternoon, my sister confronted me in the hallway. Her eyes were bloodshot, her voice raw. "What do you want from me?" she demanded. I studied her, tilting my head slightly. "Nothing." "Don't lie to me," she shouted. "I don't need to lie," I replied softly. She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You're destroying me." I stepped aside, letting her pass. My silence was her mirror, reflecting everything she couldn't face. My mother grew harsher. She snapped at me over trivial things: the laundry, the mail, the way I left a cup on the counter. Each outburst was sharper than the last. But I met her anger with calm, with a stillness that made her falter. One evening she cornered me in the kitchen. Her voice was low, urgent. "If you care about this family, you'll stop." I leaned against the counter, folding my arms. "If you cared about this family, you wouldn't have lied for 34 years. Her face twisted. For a moment I thought she might strike me. But instead she turned and left, her footsteps echoing down the hall. And still I stayed silent. Because silence was louder than any truth I could have spoken. Weeks passed. The whispers grew louder outside our walls. Inside, the tension thickened until it felt like the air itself carried weight. At night, I lay in bed listening to the creaks of the house, the muffled cries from my sister's room, the restless pacing of my mother's footsteps. I didn't feel joy. Not exactly. But I felt control. For the first time in my life, I was no longer the shadow. I was the storm they feared but couldn't name. One Sunday after church, a woman leaned close to me. Her perfume was heavy, her voice low. "Your family isn't what it seems, is it?" she asked. I looked at her steadily. "Whose family is?" Her eyes widened slightly. She nodded, satisfied, and walked away. That was all it took. By then, the silence wasn't mine alone. It was theirs. My sister stopped speaking altogether at family dinners. My mother moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps softer, her voice nearly gone. Me. I stayed steady. Patient. Because revenge doesn't always need fire. Sometimes it only needs silence. And silence was working. But silence alone was never meant to be the end. It was only the kindling. The fire had been smoldering too long, and now it was ready to burn. The night it all came to a head was cold, the kind of cold that slips into your bones even indoors. The house was quiet except for the faint creak of floorboards as my mother paced. My sister sat in the living room, her knees pulled to her chest, staring at the blank television screen. I entered without a word, but the moment I stepped in, they both looked at me. As though they knew I had arrived to say what they had been dreading to hear. I didn't drag it out. I didn't need to. "I know the truth," I said calmly. "All of it." My mother froze. Her hands trembled against the arm of the chair, gripping so tightly her knuckles turned white. "What truth?" my sister whispered, her voice cracked and raw. My eyes didn't leave my mother's face. "The truth about who he was. The man you met. The one you let into our family's bloodline." My mother's lips parted, but no sound came out. I stepped closer. 34 years. You thought you buried it. You thought Dad would die never knowing. But you forgot one thing. Secrets rot and the smell always leaks out. My sister's eyes darted between us, panic growing. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. I finally looked at her. Her face was pale, streaked with exhaustion. "You were never Dad's daughter," I said gently, though my words cut sharp. "You belonged to someone else. A man who walked in and out of her life but left you behind like a scar." She shook her head violently. "No. That's not true." "Tell me it's not true, Mom." But my mother didn't answer. Tears spilled down my sister's cheeks as she staggered back. "You knew. You knew all along." I watched as her golden image, the one she had lived in all her life, shattered in real time. Every ribbon, every trophy, every smile Dad had given her dissolved into dust. She let out a sound I had never heard before. Not a sob, not a scream, but something caught between the two. She collapsed onto the couch, her body folding into itself. And still my mother stayed silent. Finally I turned to her. "Say it," I ordered. Her eyes glistened with tears, but she shook her head. "Please. Say it." Her shoulders slumped, and in a voice so faint I almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "It's true." The words hung in the room, heavy, final. My sister wailed, her hands clawing at her hair. "How could you? How could you let me live my whole life as a lie?" My mother sobbed. "I wanted to protect you. I thought if no one knew." "Protect me?" my sister snapped, her voice breaking. "You destroyed me." She fled the room, her sobs echoing up the staircase. That left just me and my mother. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I stood tall, steady, while she crumbled in her chair. "You wanted to disgrace me with a DNA test," I said quietly. "You wanted to leave me small in his eyes, even in death." She shook her head frantically. "No, that wasn't." "Yes, it was," I cut her off. "But it backfired. Because now your golden child has turned to ash. And your secret, the one you clung to for 34 years, is out in the open." Her tears streamed freely, but I felt no pity. Not anymore. In the days that followed, the house became unbearable. My sister barely left her room. When she did, her eyes were hollow, her steps slow. My mother avoided mirrors, as though even her reflection had turned against her. But me. I moved through the house with ease. I no longer carried the weight of being less than. For the first time in my life, the burden wasn't mine. The whispers outside grew louder. Neighbors who once praised my sister now kept their distance. At the store, people looked at my mother with quiet judgment. And I didn't stop it. I let it spread. One afternoon, I found my mother sitting alone at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly around a rosary. She looked up at me with hollow eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. I pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Because you did it to me. My whole life you let me carry the shame. You let me live in the shadows while she basked in light that never belonged to her." Her lips trembled. "I was wrong." "Yes," I said simply. "You were." That night I went to Dad's grave. The sky was clear, the moonlight soft against the headstone. I knelt, my fingers brushing the cold stone. "They tried to disgrace me," I whispered. But in the end, the truth disgraced them. The wind rustled through the trees, and for the first time in years I felt light. Free. The final break came a week later. My sister stormed into the kitchen, her hair wild, her eyes blazing with fury. She slammed her fists on the table. "You ruined me," she screamed. "You couldn't stand that I was better, so you tore me down." I rose slowly, meeting her fire with calm. "I didn't ruin you. The truth did. You just never wanted to see it." She lunged as if to strike me, but stopped short, her hands trembling in the air. Then she broke again, collapsing into sobs, curling into herself like a child. I stood over her, unmoved. My mother entered then, her face pale, her hands shaking. She looked between us, horror in her eyes. "This family is finished," my sister sobbed. "No," I said quietly. "This family is finally honest." After that night, the house emptied. My sister left for a friend's, though I doubted she'd be welcomed long. My mother retreated further into herself, rarely leaving her room. Me. I found peace. Not the kind that comes with forgiveness, but the kind that comes with justice. Weeks later, I returned to Dad's grave. The air was crisp, the leaves turning gold. I stood there quietly, my hands clasped in front of me. "They thought they could bury me with lies," I whispered. "But I buried them with truth." I felt the wind on my face, gentle, steady, and I smiled. Because revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it burns quietly until the fire consumes everything false. And when the smoke clears, what's left is peace. The peace I had been denied my whole life. The peace I finally claimed. If this story moved you, hit subscribe for more dark, emotional stories of betrayal and revenge. You are not alone. These stories are for women like us.